Hello, dear students. Today I'm going to talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman and feminist Gothic showcased in the yellow wallpaper. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an American feminist, lecturer, writer, and publisher who was a leading theorist of the women's movement in the United States. Charlotte grew up in poverty, her father having essentially abandoned the family. Her education was thus irregular and limited. In 1884, she married Charles W. Stetson, an artist. She soon proved to be totally unsuited to the domestic routine of marriage, and after a year or so, she was suffering from melancholia, which resulted in complete nervous collapse. After she moved to California, Perkins began writing poems and short stories for various periodicals. Among her stories, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in the New England Magazine in January 1892, was exceptional for its starkly realistic first person portrayal of the mental breakdown of a physically pampered but emotionally starved young wife. The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1892, is thus regarded as a classic in feminist literature. Written in the early 1970s, The Yellow Wallpaper is an early feminist indictment of Victorian patriarchy. This story contains many typical Gothic trappings, but beneath the conventional facade lies a tale of repression and freedom told in intricate symbolism as seen through the eyes of an insane narrator. The Yellow Wallpaper gives an account of a woman driven to madness as a result of the Victorian rest cure, a frequently prescribed period of inactivity thought to cure hysteria and nervous conditions in women. Dr. Ware Michel personally prescribed this rest cure to Gilman herself. She was in fact driven to near madness and later claimed to have written the yellow wallpaper to protest this treatment of women like herself and specifically to address Dr. Ware Michel with a propaganda piece. A copy of the story was actually sent to Dr. Michel, and although he never replied to Gilman personally, he is said to have confessed to a friend that he had changed his treatment of hysterics after reading the story. Although the autobiographical aspects of the yellow wallpaper are compelling, it is the symbolism and the underlying feminist connotations that lead best to discussion. First is the narrator's husband, John. He could be regarded as patriarchy itself, with his constant condescension to his wife. But some critics have viewed this character as a near caricature. He is a natural complement to the narrator's madness and uncontrolled fancy. Greg Johnson notes that John exhibits a near obsession with reason, even as his wife grows mad. He is the narrator's necessary counterpart, without whose stifling influence her eventual freedom would not be gained. And he is also transformed at the end of the tale in a reversal of traditional Gothic roles because it is he, not a female, who faints when confronted with madness. Central to the story is the wallpaper itself. It is within the wallpaper that the narrator finds her hidden self and her eventual freedom. Her obsession with the paper begins subtly and then consumes both the narrator and the story. Once settled in the long, empty ancestral estate, a typical Gothic setting, the narrator is dismayed to learn that her husband has chosen the top floor nursery room for her. The room is papered in horrible yellow wallpaper. The design begins to fascinate the narrator, and she begins to see more than just the outer design. At first, she sees bulbous eyes and absurd, unblinking eyes everywhere. The wallpaper gradually consumes the narrator's being, offering up more complex images as time passes. She first notices the different colored sub pattern of a figure beneath the front design. This figure is eventually seen as a woman who creeps and shakes the outer pattern, now seen to the narrator as bars. Professor Emeritus Gary Skansnoth says that this woman figure becomes essentially the narrator's doppelganger or double, trapped behind the bars of her role in patriarchy. As the story progresses, the narrator identifies more and more with the figure in the wallpaper until she refers to herself in third person. In the statement, the narrator says, I quote, I got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, unquote. This statement allows for many different interpretations. There is an interesting connection between the mad narrator of the yellow wallpaper and the character Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. When viewed as a polarized or split identity, the link between Jane Eyre, Bertha Mason, and narrator Jane wallpaper figure is quite clear. The first in both pairs is the conventional self, the rational self, and the second is the raging and uncontrolled woman. Greg Johnson says it is the anger, the boiling rage of these alter egos that results in the eventual triumph over their patriarchal influences. There is another similarity between Bertha Mason and the narrator of the yellow wallpaper. They both creep or crawl about on all fours. This may be an identification with animal behavior or a way to explain that both characters have lost touch with civilization or the patriarchy. Another feature of this tale is the prison or the nursery in which the narrator observes her wallpaper, the heavy bedstead which is nailed to the floor. The interpretations of this feature are variations on a theme ranging from the image of the narrator's static sexuality as stated by Scannhorst or to a sexual crucifixion as stated by Johnson. These statements ring true regarding Victorian sexuality. It was as immobile as a moving bedstead. Victorian women were counseled that conjugal relations were a woman's duty simply to be endured until a sufficient number of children arrived and it was no longer necessary. In this context, the image of the nailed down bed becomes perhaps the most understandable symbol in the entire story. In fact, it is significant that the entire story revolves around the wallpaper, which would be considered by many to be merely feminine frivolity. The Victorian woman had so little control over her own life that it was through these frivolities, such as clothing and even the wallpaper, that these women exercised their autonomy. It seems significant, therefore, that the narrator's madness is expressed through the chiefly feminine symbol of wallpaper. The yellow wallpaper, though a wonderful and frightening Gothic tale, will probably continue to be thought of in feminist terms. By reading and understanding the madness in the yellow wallpaper, we could possibly prevent such psychomatic horrors in the future.